I'd like to welcome everyone virtually within the walls of the World Trade Organization here in Geneva. We're absolutely delighted that you could join us. This is a very important event for us, and it's going to be a very rich and I think urgently needed conversation. Just to put this into context, because it's something of a novelty for us and it comes at a very critical time. This is a public webinar and we welcome the broad public engagement. At the same time, it is part of a capacity building course that we annually run for the benefit of officials from developing country governments. It also comes at a time when obviously public health issues are absolutely paramount. And as the globe is gripped by an unprecedented health crisis. I want to mention both of these points just to make clear how this webinar fits into all of this. You will know from the headlines, and many of you know in great detail, that in the WTO there are very urgent discussions and other work going about how and in what ways to work with the existing international system, what more must be done in the area of intellectual property, but more broadly trade policy as well, to address the COVID pandemic. And in taking a broader view today, we're certainly not suggesting that this is not an absolute priority, far from it. But today's activity is part of a broader capacity building program to enhance understanding of the practical use of the system that we have available, the measures that are available, and to discuss how to improve the knowledge foundation, the empirical platform that we all need to work from. And I'd like, therefore, to set this webinar in that broader context. Of course, we will be talking about the pandemic. It's a dramatic, tragic impact around the globe, and every country on the planet, every government is fully engaged in addressing that. But by taking a broader view in today's event, and looking at, if you like, the policy infrastructure, the empirical questions, the deeper structural questions that we'll be exploring, we hope to strengthen capacity and understanding so that specific tools can be most effectively applied across the globe. So I hope that does help set it in context, this is by far, by a long way, by no means the sole or immediate focus of the WTO as such on these issues. To the contrary, there is a massive amount of work going on at every level. This is part of a broader picture. So it's for me to welcome you all to this webinar. The focus is very timely on dissemination of health technologies. As I've mentioned, this does form part of an ongoing capacity building course, our annual course on trade and health, primarily for the benefit of our member governments and government officials. But today we wanted to open up the program a little to the public for a broader perspective, and also because we have been fortunate to attract a number of absolute leading international experts who have been very kind in setting the time aside, sometimes the time in very unfriendly time zones where they're based. And so in a sense, these are very important insights, not only for the immediate participants in our training course, but for a wider public audience. And so this is really why we're organising it in this way. So we are in the situation, because it is, of course, impossible for us to get together still physically, and we do regret the lack of interactivity and engagement that this represents, but at the same time, we're hoping to make the most of it in two ways. Firstly, we can bring in a wider range of leading international experts than has been possible in the past. And secondly, we can reach out to a wider, more inclusive audience and set of participants. And I say participants because we do hope that this will be as interactive as possible. And we will be inviting you to field questions and comments that we will pass on to the panelists in the interactive session. You've already heard enough from me, and I don't want to take any more time, but I would simply say the reputations of our panelists speak for themselves. As I say, we're extremely fortunate to have at our disposal for this event, and I would encourage all of you to have a look at their CVs, which are available on our website. That gives us more time to learn what we can benefit from this agreement. We'll be hearing from Professor Ian Coburn, the Richard Shipley Professor of Management at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University, Mr. Tim Wilston, who's Vice President of Charles River Associates, Professor Edward Ball, Eminent Scholar, Professor of International Law at the Florida State University College of Law, Dr. Paul Werner, who's Senior Vice President at Axela, and Professor Margaret Kyle, Professor of Economics at NIN Paris Tech at the Center for Industrial Economics. So with that, I certainly invite you to put your comments and questions in the Q&A box. If it's for a specific speaker, please do identify that speaker, and we'll try to direct the traffic of that inquiry. Because despite this dispersed arrangement, we certainly want to make this as a conversation and not simply a series of presentations. So first, we'll be hearing from Professor Coburn and Mr. Tim Wilston on the role of the TRIPS agreement, the WTO agreement on intellectual property, in relation to the diffusion of health technology. Then there'll be a separate session when we'll hear from Professor Abbott, Dr. Werner, and Professor Kyle. So that's the formalities done with. I'm very keen to get onto the substance, and very gladly now pass the floor to Professor Coburn. Ian, over to you. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm going to share my screen and talk around a brief PowerPoint presentation I put together to summarize the findings of a study I conducted together with colleagues at Charles River Associates London office on this, I think, very important issue of how the TRIPS agreement and intellectual property rights play a role in encouraging technology diffusion. I acknowledge up front the support from the IFPMA, as well as very useful input from numerous individuals at WTO, WHO, various pharmaceutical companies, and colleagues in academia. So here's the agenda for my brief talk. I'll give some introduction and motivation, talk about the empirical work that we did in terms of its methodology and results, and then highlight the conclusions from our study. What we try to do here is look at a sometimes overlooked or underemphasized aspect of the TRIPS agreement, which is the idea that by fostering a stronger intellectual property environment, there are significant economic benefits which arise from technology diffusion around the world. I think this is particularly important in the context of emerging markets and developing countries. When we think about how new technology diffuses around the world, there are a variety of channels. One of which, perhaps most obviously, is trade and production of products that embody new inventions and new ideas. So in the pharmaceutical context, work by myself, by Professor Kyle, who's also in this meeting, and others, I think have shown that stronger intellectual property rights result in faster and more widespread availability of these new products. In the pharmaceutical context, this would be drugs and vaccines and so forth. But it's also the case that new ideas travel around the world through other channels. In particular, there's participation in science and research. So collaborations and interactions between academic institutions as well as industrial researchers is a very important way in which new ideas move around. There's also the sort of formal legal channel of licensing of new ideas and inventions. Now, I think there's a tendency to overlook the impact of the intellectual property rights environment on the second of these two. Economists have coined the phrase markets for technology to help us think more clearly about this process of trade and movement of economically useful knowledge and technology. And this market for ideas is one in which clear, enforceable intellectual property rights play a critical role, even in the context of academic research. I think when you look at in the pharmaceutical industry in particular, when you look at the fairly close and very productive collaborations between industry and academia, a lot of this has been supported by the ability to draw clear lines and establish property rights over the products of research, and to allow open science to thrive alongside an interaction with the system which is supported by patents and other forms of intellectual property. It's also the case with licensing. It's certainly possible to reach license agreements and to transfer technology from one organization or one location to another, without formal intellectual property rights. That can be done, but I think it's challenging and difficult to think about that kind of formal, legal, contractual way of exchanging ideas if you don't have strong intellectual property rights. So with that as background, what we did in this study was to collect data on a variety of indicators of the operation of these channels for diffusion. So scientific research as proxied by publication of articles in the scientific literature, commercial research, which we pick up by the grant of patents. We also look at engagement in the research process in pharmaceutical development, which is involvement in conducting clinical trials. And then finally, we look at the data that we are able to collect on licensing royalties. All of these, point are indicators of the flow of knowledge or the diffusion of new ideas. Now we take those indicators of technology diffusion and try to establish their association with the intellectual property rights regime, which was ushered in by the TRIPS agreement. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, this was staged over time. And we use statistical methods to try to isolate, the impact of strengthening of intellectual property rights as part of that TRIPS process from the effect of other, broad drivers of innovation and economic growth. I'll just caution that, it's a challenge in any kind of observational retrospective study to establish very clearly that there's a causal relationship. We believe we've, the most modest way to describe our results is that we've established an association rather than an absolute causal relationship. But it's, the methods we use, I think, strongly suggest to us that we're done a lot better than establishing just a mere correlation. So let me just review very quickly. I'm sure everybody on this call has a general idea of what the TRIPS agreement was and how it was staged over time. Different countries came into compliance with their obligations under the treaty at different periods of time. One of the things which I think distinguishes our study from other work, which has looked more generally at TRIPS and economic growth and technology diffusion, is that we focus very tightly on those aspects of the TRIPS agreement which are specific to pharmaceuticals. So we look at whether pharmaceutical products qualify as patentable subject matter. We look at the extent to which trade secrets are protected, and in particular, and finally, we look at this, something that is very important in the pharmaceutical industry, which is protection for data submitted as part of health and safety regulatory review. So, based upon prior work done by some other people and some updating and some focusing in on different countries' statutory provisions, we come up with a means of scoring the extent to which a country has become pharmaceutical specific TRIPS compliant, and at what date. And you can see that there's considerable variation around the world, particularly in the emerging markets and developing countries. So it's that variation which we use to try to we assess the impact of the strength of these pharmaceutical specific intellectual property rights on these measures of technology diffusion, which we compiled. The report that we wrote and the paper we're hoping to publish in an academic journal go through the statistical analysis in great detail. We neither have the time nor is this the right place to talk about regression coefficients and so forth. But the slide I'm showing here summarizes the key findings from our statistical analysis. So let me step through each of these indicators of technology diffusion one by one. I think the first and very interesting issue is that of basic research. We find that an increase in any one of patent coverage for pharmaceutical products, protection for trade secrets, or protection of data submission is associated with about a 1/5 increase in the number of published articles per thousand population in a country. You can see that perhaps one of the most important of these indicators is restrictions on patentability of pharmaceutical products. Removing any exclusions from patentability of pharmaceutical products is associated with a 24% increase in basic research. Providing additional data exclusivity also has a similar magnitude. So I think that's often maybe counterintuitive to some people, but basic research conducted within a country is increases significantly once a country, the more a country becomes TRIPS compliant on these pharmaceutical specific dimensions, right, the more basic research in medicine and related sciences gets done. Commercial research, that is to say, R&D done by industry, we also find substantially increases in countries which have become more TRIPS compliant on these dimensions. Participation in clinical trials is another indicator that we looked at. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, recent decades have seen a great increase in activity in clinical trials research worldwide, with clinical trial sites popping up in many countries outside North America and Europe. We see here a statistically significant positive impact on the number of clinical trials published with participation of researchers from that country. Once you remove any restrictions on patentability of pharmaceutical products. Finally, we look at knowledge transfer. We collected data on IP licensing receipts, and we find a very significant increase, more than 50% in that indicator of knowledge transfer, when as a country becomes more TRIPS compliant. You'll see in this table, some of these effects are marked as not statistically significant. I think it's reflects challenges in measurement, but also the fact that one should be, I think, appropriately cautious, even though the effect may be in this, have a size and a magnitude which is consistent with your hypotheses. You just want to be careful about the precision with which that effect can be estimated. So I'll conclude. Our investigation, our quantitative investigation of the extent to which strengthening intellectual property rights contributes to technology transfer, suggests quite large and quite significant impacts. Countries which have taken steps towards strengthening intellectual property rights as they apply to pharmaceuticals have seen greater incentive to conduct scientific research. That has the economic effect of expanding capacity in the knowledge base in that country. It helps facilitate local innovation. It helps attract and support engagement in clinical trials. Again, it develops local capacity. And finally, supports the legal channel for transfer of ideas and technology through licensing. Ultimately, we believe that there's a clear economic pathway from strengthening intellectual property rights to faster, better, and easier technology transfer, development of local innovation capacity and activity, which all in turn, fuel economic growth. So, while the policy debate about TRIPS, tends to focus on the idea that strengthening intellectual property rights for pharmaceuticals has the potential to raise their prices and negatively impact developing countries and emerging markets because of affordability concerns. Our study points to a substantial effect on the other side of the coin, positive impacts on economic growth, on local innovative capacity. So I'll leave you to look at the summary slides. I think I'm reaching the limit of my time, and I'll thank you for your attention and welcome your comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Coburn, for that overview of the research done, spanning, of course, a significant period of time, and clearly we're talking here about the regular context and not the immediate pandemic matter, but that's maybe something we can discuss separately. We now turn to our panel of experts to comment on Professor Coburn's paper. I'd like to introduce, as the first commentator, Professor Abbott. Over to you, Fred.
Okay, can you hear me?
Very well.
All right. Oh. All right. Well, I had the benefit, unlike many of the participants, of being able to review the paper in advance. And I want to thank Professor Cockburn and Mr. Wilsden, because they have made me feel young again by taking me back to the mid-1980s during the initial TRIPS dialogue and debate. And at that time, you may remember the demandeurs trying to explain to developing countries why providing high levels of patent protection would be beneficial for them, particularly in the context of inducing more domestic innovation and ultimately the development of new products. But that was not really the core of the TRIPS debate and why you had developing country resistance at that time. And Professor Coburn mentioned that toward the end of his discussion, which was to look at the balance between outflows on payment of patent rents for patented pharmaceutical products as compared to local expenditures on generic products. And if you look at data regarding balance of payments and public health systems today, the data shows a very heavy skewing that persists to this day on outflows and heavy rent payments for patent protected originator products, whereas generic products provide the bulk of volume for public health systems. The budgetary strains are created by the rent outflows. And if you look at, so we'll get to this in a second, but if you look at the theory, but that will be offset by innovation taking place locally in developing countries through those grants. And indeed, I don't challenge the hypothesis that there are benefits in terms of licensing effects, in terms of being able to use patents as basically securitized instruments for the transfer of technology. You do not as yet, and now we're talking, close to 30 years on already, you don't really see new innovator products emerging from developing country markets. You might be able to cite one or two isolated examples, but nothing that begins to offset in terms of revenues that might be gained from that, the outflows that are spent on basically paying patent rents. So it's interesting that we continue a process of, justifying the grant of patents by developing countries through economic analysis, which again goes all the way back, of course, well, even to the 1950s and so forth. But I don't think the basic underlying dynamic of the TRIPS agreement has changed in that regard. Now, I don't fault the authors for using proxies in their paper because they're not actually pointing to the development of innovative products. They're talking about secondary proxies, so papers written by academics, clinical trials, patents that are granted. But if you look, for example, at the 2017 in-depth study by the US Government Accounting Office of innovation trends, for example, in the United States, where you have huge expenditures on patents and patent-protected pharmaceuticals, you see that only 13% of the entities submitted for approval by the FDA are genuine novel therapies. So most patents are being granted for minor improvements, new dosages and formulations and new patient populations and so forth. So the patent system is yielding a relatively limited set of genuine innovative products, number one. Number two, when we get to the underlying statistics, so the authors use published papers and patents. And here I simply raise the issue of China, which I assume that the authors accounted for, because you have a tremendous number of patent applications filed and a tremendous number of pharmaceutical related patents in China. You also have a tremendous outflow of academic papers. But if you look at the research by people like Wenting Chang and Peter Drahos, you'll see that the government basically pays bounties for filing patent applications and for publishing academic papers. China will acknowledge that it has, to this date, accepted a pretty substantial amount of relatively low quality patents. And because there is so much activity in China, I'm tempted to think that the data might be quite skewed, depending on how China data is factored in. It isn't necessarily going to genuine innovation. It's going to patent applications and published academic papers, which are proxies and different things. I would also note that, well, it's basically self-evident that if you go from not having patent protection to having patent protection, that you're going to have more patent applications filed. It could hardly be any other way, and that was an issue in the Eli Lilly case up in Canada. Just a couple of other points is that again, in the Uruguay round negotiations, one of the points the developing countries made and pushed back on was, well, if patents are good for us, we can adopt them. We don't need the TRIPS agreement to tell us to do that. We don't need to come under diplomatic pressure for not doing it. So if indeed there are tremendous benefits from this, you could expect us to figure that out for ourselves, and we don't need a multilateral accord to accomplish that purpose. I find the papers, let us call, well, I'm tempted to use the word attack on Section 3D of India's Patent Act as somehow leading to a reduction in innovation. It's peculiar in the first place because India's Section 3D, which requires a showing of significant enhancement in efficacy, actually strengthens patent protection. It doesn't weaken it. And also why the authors have chosen to single that out as a point of address kind of strikes me as odd. If you look at the successful development of pharmaceutical sectors, well, you take the most prominent, China and India. both rapidly advanced by following weak patent policies, later replaced today in China, for example, by strong patent policies. But it's really, if you look at Keith Maskus's famous developmental curve, you can say that you begin with a system of appropriation and replication and move towards strong patent protection is the way that the very successful pharmaceutical industries have been developed over the past decade or two. So again, this is a debate that goes back to the negotiation of the TRIPS agreement, and we're back in that territory. And of course, you have, economists like Sudip Chaudhuri in India who might challenge some of the hypothesis from the standpoint of the Indian domestic experience. So I raise those few points of challenge as a counterpoint to the paper and look forward to further discussion about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. Thank you for engaging with the paper so thoroughly. I think a good basis for our ensuing conversation. I now turn to our second commentator, Dr. Perner. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, and let me begin by saying it's a real honor to be part of the discussion today. Given my background, it may not come as a surprise that I don't completely agree with everything that Fred has said. In fact, I found it quite empowering and reassuring that the paper does show this correlation between innovation and reasonably strong intellectual property rights. And I think this is a correlation that is important to note, because while intellectual property rights, in my view, are an important component of innovation, they're not on their own sufficient to stimulate or generate innovation. That said, it's useful to have some empirical knowledge and evidence to show the positive correlation. I think I would challenge anybody to show the inverse correlation, that the lack of an intellectual property regime somehow supports an innovative economy. And indeed, I would take the example that Dr. Abbott raised of the comparison of India and China. Both largely initiated technology through adoption, copying of others. And this is a historical cycle. The same was true to some degree in the United States. The pharmaceutical industry in Switzerland owes its origins to copying the German patented products, but the patents didn't extend to Switzerland, so they could create a strong chemical industry in the 19th century. The difference is that China has evolved its system to a strong, relatively strong intellectual property rights regime, and India has not. And I think we are seeing China largely outpace India in all aspects of technology, while India scrambles to keep up. And I think the issue is that the intellectual property rights is a long game. It's not a short game. The short-term game is waiving intellectual property rights to try to accelerate COVID-19 solutions, as we've seen in the World Trade Organization recently by India and South Africa, and oddly, recently supported by the United States. This actually, in my view, will have little or no positive impact on accelerating COVID-19 treatments, because it's just too little time to pivot and implement the patented technologies or somehow try to lever out the trade secret ones. And over the long term, it disincentivizes the investments that went into these technologies. I think it's important to note that intellectual property is the foundation of open innovation as much as it's the foundation of the sort of closed, highly competitive innovation that we see in the pharmaceutical industry. I think a strong TRIPS regime provides a platform for then incentivizing open innovation. I'll get to this in more detail in my remarks in the second part. But I think I want to make the point because one of the elements, the positive elements of this correlation that I think we could look to is the adoption of the and implementation of TRIPS by a country is consistent with other factors like a a predictable and robust underlying legal system. Dr. Cockburn talked, for example, about how you can use contracts perhaps only, but contracts are much stronger when there's an intellectual property right backing it up. This is the power of open innovation. It's a contractual relationship backed up by an intellectual property set of intellectual property rights to ensure compliance and enforcement and balance. But it's not necessarily the case that intellectual property rights are always implemented through negative enforcement, through that holding until the rights are gone for a competitive advantage. The implementation of the rights is a choice and can be encouraged, particularly by the funders of intellectual property, to be used in a more positive and pro-societal way, in a sense. And I would say in the pharmaceutical industry, this is very much the case, because patents are used to block competitors. More importantly, trade secrets and confidential information, particularly manufacturing technology, slow competitors down. That's not a necessary use of those forms of intellectual property. It's just the way that they're used now. I wouldn't blame the regime. It's more the people with the money, which is ultimately the buyers of these pharmaceuticals, could take a more active role in how the technology is implemented, since at the end of the day, they're the ones funding it. Let me stop there, and I'll have some more remarks when we get to the next section, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you again for engaging with the ongoing conversation. I think we've got the makings of a really interesting debate here. Our next commentator, equally eminent, coming in from Paris, I think, Professor Margaret Kyle. Margaret, over to you, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. I am normally based in Paris, but actually today I'm on the East Coast with a rather unstable internet connection, so I apologize in advance if there are some technical complications here. So the disadvantage of being the last to comment is that, of course, many of the points that I wanted to make were made by those who preceded me, which again, says something about great minds thinking alike or something along those lines. So what's left for me to say? So I have a few comments, and I hope, again, that this gives us something to discuss and debate at greater length, and probably in future meetings, because I don't think we'll resolve it today. So the one concern raised is the utility of some of these proxy measures for the underlying variables of interest. So just as an example, patents per 1,000 people is a proxy for commercial research. As has already been stated, an increase in patentability is almost surely going to be associated with an increase in patents. But ultimately, what we care about is, are those patents associated with useful innovations? So we know that the distribution of patents is highly skewed. Most of them, including in the US or anywhere else, are not particularly valuable. We only really care about the set of valuable patents, and particularly if there are other policies in place, as was stated about China, to sort of artificially inflate some of these numbers, because this has been an aspect of international competition, sometimes between countries, to show how innovative they are. Then while I certainly accept that there has been an increase, it's not necessarily obvious to me that this is linked with directly with the fundamental goals of the TRIPS agreement. I was also, I have to say, rather surprised about the results on basic research. And so I would like to hear more from the authors and from other participants here on their feelings on how or why IP would affect basic research in this context. Why is, for example, data protection particularly important? I guess my prior was that this is precisely an area where too much intellectual property could reduce access to patented materials, could reduce could increase the costs of accessing those materials in some cases, and perhaps reduce research. So that is sometimes cited as a potential issue, the tragedy of the anti-commons in the US context, why would it be an issue in developed countries, but not an issue in these developing countries that are the subject of this study? So my last point would be the question of primary versus secondary patents and the 3D issue in India. So pharmaceuticals, that's a very special type of special area for patent protection. In particular, primary patents, the patents around the molecule itself, most people accept that that is a fundamental innovation that should be protected for all sorts of reasons. A lot of the debate, both in developed countries and in developing countries, is around the protection of secondary patents, and that's what 3D is also about. And I think there, and this is related to my point about too much intellectual property protection before, we probably do need more studies to understand the right design of patent laws in these contexts. So TRIPS requires the protection, requires primary patents on the molecules, that's fine. TRIPS does not necessarily require protection on all of the new uses and processes, et cetera. And it might be that strong and narrow protection is best for pharmaceuticals versus very broad protection that could introduce frictions in the R&D process for competing firms, et cetera. So I think there we probably need more nuanced studies rather than just these very broad, either the country grants pharmaceutical patents or not. There's a lot of nuance there in how that plays out in reality. And with 3D in particular, I think we have perhaps an interesting case study to look at. So let me stop there, and hopefully we have a few minutes left for discussion.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And indeed, this is unprecedented in Geneva. I think we're right on time because we set aside exactly 10 minutes now for discussion and follow-up. And we have fielded a number of questions from the participants and, of course, from our panelists as well. In the interest of time, I might touch on several of those questions now and initially invite Professor Coburn to comment on them together, just so that we can cover as much territory as possible. One issue, and I guess this gets into the point of that was debated about strength of patenting, which is a, well, to take a step back, if we're looking at a stronger empirical foundation for policy, that raises questions about what we measure and whether that's an effective proxy for broader phenomena, and then how to interpret those data. And so that one issue that's come up in that context is the strength of patenting. And we have an inquiry, a question from Sara Lucia from Colombia about the impact of TRIPS plus measures on the technology of pharmaceutical products. I mean, the focus of the study was on TRIPS, but of course we know that in a number of bilateral treaties, there are additional TRIPS plus measures which typically restrict the scope of poultry licensing, for example, or they may extend patent term or provide similar provisions, but may have bearing on the measure of strength of patenting. Also, Martin Correa has made the point that when we hear from pharmaceutical firms about their investment choices and their research direction, they take a holistic view, looking at issues such as tax benefits, tariff reductions, and public funding. Of course, a very topical issue right now, the role of public funding for research and development. And he's wondering to what extent those broader factors could be taken into account for this research. There's other questions which relate specifically to COVID, but let's turn to those subsequently, because I'd like to hear from Professor Coburn on those points, and if you'd like to respond to any of the comments made by our panelists. So over to you. Thank you, Ian.
Well, let me begin by thanking everybody for their comments, which are well taken. I think just to maybe situate or how to think about the findings of these studies slightly differently. The pharmaceutical industry has seen, like many other industries, has seen a dramatic transformation towards being a globalized industry in which all the various activities which go into the value chain for creating a pharmaceutical have become increasingly geographically dispersed. So I think everybody's familiar with this in the context of, say, IT and semiconductors. Now, pharmaceuticals has proceeded less dramatically, more slowly than semiconductors, but it's certainly the case that the global research and production enterprise in life sciences, it no longer takes place within a single organization located in a single country. One way I think to see the impact of strengthening of IPRs is the extent to which it's made countries are able to participate in this global production system in life sciences to a greater or lesser degree. So all our, the various things, proxies that we try to measure, you could understand as just being aspects of different levels of engagement in this global research enterprise. So I don't think it's so much the number of patents per se is something we should necessarily be focused on, so much as understanding it's related to the number of commercial scientists active in that country who are engaged in activity which can create patents. The same thing with publication of scientific papers, participation in clinical trials, and so forth. So I would see at the very highest level the findings of our study as supporting the notion that engagement in this global research enterprise is critically dependent on the extent to which a country provides a variety of resources and infrastructure, and in particular, as Dr. Fellner pointed out, the availability of intellectual property rights as part of the infrastructure for doing that. I don't really want to open up the can of worms about purported evergreening and primary patents and secondary patents and so forth. That's a complicated debate. In the context of the specific context of India's Section 3D, I think it's a choice which India has made, which has costs and benefits. And one of the costs you should recognize is the extent to which this makes India, a less attractive market for the global pharmaceutical industry to participate in. Certainly, the industry has viewed Section 3D as having a serious negative impact on their ability to engage with the Indian market. Tim, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add in response to the comments.
Or maybe just a couple of comments. So on the China effect and whether we were kind of biased towards China, we spent a lot of time worrying about that, as you can imagine. We've done quite a lot of testing to check the results are robust, and it's not an outlier driving the results. So to some degree, we've controlled for that on a statistical basis, but it's a great point and one we were worried about quite a lot. The second point on are we allowing for other factors such as the tax regime, other factors supporting these things? We tried to control for that. People will see in the longer paper the number of variables we allowed for. There's only so many things that you can capture data that goes across 53 countries over 26 years, and that's one of the one of the challenges here. So we accept on some of the regressions there are some missing variables. We're particularly worried about that on the clinical trial data, that we're not capturing things like the process and to some degree the infrastructure and the skills. So there's clearly some missing variables there. But what we were trying to do was to show the range of technology diffusion characteristics in a systematic way, and partly you pay for that by having a systematic structure, a single structure. So we've tried where possible to let the data show it. Why we included the patent restrictions, I think there would have been people who said if we left it out, people would have said we should have allowed for it. So, but given there was a debate on that, and there was a debate on the length of the data exclusivity period, the choice was to let the data speak. So that was the idea. So, as Margaret, your point on are the coefficients exactly what we might have expected from our priors? We've spent a lot of time staring at them. They're intriguing, some of them, but I think, as Ian, you would agree, some of them deserve more research. Why are we picking up those and not others? And just final point on a boring econometrics point. We say in the paper where specifications and the structure of those relationships can lead to some other results, but we thought, to be fair, we should show a consistent set of results. But you'll find more techie econometrics in the longer paper, Margaret.
I'll just say one more very brief on the topic of China. On this, I should always be careful of anecdotes, but something which I've always, certainly shaped my thinking here was here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's one of the geographic centers of life science innovation. And at some point, about 5 years ago, a very large billboard popped up in the outskirts of MIT, which was from Wuxi Biopharmaceuticals, right? Advertising their scientific capabilities and strength and availability to be a contract research partner with the usual kind of big pharma suspects who are located all around that billboard. And I think that in itself points to the significance of the globalization of research and the importance of intellectual property rights in supporting that. It's impossible to imagine that billboard being put up, and which signals the kind of deep engagement and big money and active participation had China not acceded to the WTO and had not taken the steps it's taken to strengthen its intellectual property environment.
We have another question which plays into this a little, both the question of whether, to what extent China's undoubtedly, shall we say, distinctive position has bearing on the results, and also the question of strength of patenting, because we have a question saying, well, Professor Coburn, you've said that China has a strong IP system and so on, whereas it has been China has been criticized by a certain trading partner as not having sufficient IP protection. Could I invite you and all the panelists to offer a quick comment on that point and any other specific points? To those who have put in questions relating to COVID, I will keep them with us because these are clearly extremely important. And so rather than rush through them now, we'll bundle them together for the closing reflection, because that's obviously very much at the forefront of all our concerns. So don't worry, those questions are noted and we'll come back to them. So please, if I can turn to you, Ian, and then very quickly the other panelists. Just a quick wrap-up comment. Thank you.
I think the issue with China's IP regime is, as they say, complicated. I mean, China has moved statutory, has put in place a legal framework which very much aligns it in the direction that in North America, Europe, and other OECD countries. At the same time, I think there have been difficulties in enforcement of intellectual property rights historically within China. I think it's rapidly evolving. China's developing its legal capacity and its interest in having the ability to resolve disputes around intellectual property in a timely and predictable manner.
Thank you. Any other commenters, panelists want to comment at the moment? Or we can move on to the next session.
I would just add that the more recent issue with China has been this requirement for companies who wish to do business in China to disclose their trade secret technology, to do technology sharing as a condition of market access. This for me is a choice though, and it's a choice that I think I'm not necessarily sure I agree with, but if you're not going to push back against it, if you're going to allow your partner to fleece you, you will be fleeced. I think a lot of retailers learn the same lesson in working with Amazon, notably, for example, the Toys R Us franchise, which allowed Amazon in unconditionally and then had was consumed from inside. The notion, I think there's still industrial espionage, and that's obviously illegal and should be enforced. Another issue is if you take appropriate somebody else's technology, you may be able to use that in your market, but you can't export it. So there are limits to the value of doing that. That US patent or US intellectual property protection is going to block the product from the US market, or at least have that potential. So I think it's a more nuanced situation. And the pharmaceutical side, I've absolutely seen evolution of the Chinese patent office into what I regarded at last time I was actually actively prosecuting patents as a first-rate patent office. And frankly, with the US undermining patent protection for important technologies in the software industry and having that leak over into biotech, I'm not sure I would rate the US intellectual property protection regime as significantly higher than, and maybe even lower than, what's available in China now.
And Tony, I'd like to add a comment as well. I do not question that China has been moving very much in the direction of a strong patent protection regime with respect to pharmaceuticals and increasing the regulatory data protection and so forth to the extent that they might be increasingly portrayed as a higher protection regime, again, going back to the point I made earlier about the transition from a technology absorber to a technology developer and ultimately a technology proposed exporter. And that, I mean, this is pretty clear. I think one of the things, though, that distinguishes China, and I think this is very important, if the Chinese government looks at the market and says the price of X drug, let's say the price of X cancer drug is too high, the Chinese government says you are going to lower the price. And I would say almost invariably the price is lowered and pretty much to the place where the Chinese government wants it set. I am not critiquing that. I mean, the Chinese government is using patents as a form of preferred industrial policy, but at the same time, it's looking at its domestic public health market and saying we're not going to let people extract prices that we don't think they should be extracting. So you have to balance what China's doing, but certainly the trend has been towards stronger protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you to all the panelists. We should move on to the second session now. There's a couple of questions we've fielded, but these are general in nature, and indeed they're quite relevant to the presentations we're just about to hear. So again, we're not setting those questions aside. We'll find scope for them, and I think the presentations you're just about to hear will help illuminate those questions anyway. So the second session deals with innovation and diffusion of health technology. Again, thinking of practical considerations and policies on innovation, sharing of intellectual property, and local production or the dissemination of of production capacity. So our first speaker in this session is Professor Margaret Kyle. Margaret, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've been asked to speak about innovation policies in pharma, which is a very broad topic to cover in 10 minutes. I'll start with patents because patents, I think, get the most attention in this context, and I think appropriately so. Patents are a very important innovation policy tool for pharmaceuticals in particular. Arguably, patents work better in a pharmaceutical context than variables on the other. And the paper that we heard earlier contributes to a large body of evidence at this point, in my view, that that demonstrates that overall, on average, patents do pull in R&D investment. I think where there is debate is not so much whether that average effect exists, it's whether the R&D investment that is pulled in is socially valuable in all cases, and whether that R&D investment pull occurs equally across all countries. So in general, the results that we have demonstrate that patents are very effective at pulling in R&D investment in rich countries, in developed countries. The evidence for that effect in the context of developing countries is much weaker. So I have some work on that showing that an increase in associated with TRIPS protections in developing countries is associated with an increase in R&D effort for diseases that are important in the countries that adopt those, as long as those diseases are also prevalent in fairly advanced markets. Where patents do not work so well is in the context of neglected diseases or technologies that are specific to poorer countries. So I think it's important to recognize that patents only work if there's a reasonably well-functioning market in a country supporting it. So putting in patent protection where profits are zero with or without patent protection is not going to be a particularly effective policy instrument in pulling in R&D. Another issue with patents is that they are fairly blunt policy instruments. So they are 20-year terms. They don't vary with the importance of a patent in the sense of the therapeutic value associated with a treatment that's patented. It's the same treatment for all diseases, regardless of the social value in treating a particular disease. So they're not a perfect policy tool, but they are, on average, pretty effective. Because they're not a perfect policy tool, it's worthwhile discussing the alternatives or complementary policies that can also be appropriate in some cases. So one such policy tool, which is, of course, an important component of many of the TRIPS plus negotiations that have taken place and that are ongoing, would be market exclusivity terms. So unlike a patent whose term of protection begins at the point of patent application, before all of the product development and clinical development has occurred, market exclusivity terms begin when a product reaches the market. So that reduces some of the risk for investors in the time, the potential delays associated in clinical development, and gives them a stronger or a better idea of how many years they will have on the market to recoup their investments. I think an advantage of market exclusivity terms, in addition to reducing the potential distortion in R&D efforts associated with that variation in clinical development times, is that in theory, market exclusivity terms can also be tied to therapeutic value or provide additional protection in contexts, particularly disease contexts, where we think the social value is especially high. So as an example of that, many richer countries provide extra protection for orphan drugs. And the idea there is that patents themselves, by themselves, are not providing sufficient boost to R&D investment, but extra market exclusivity terms, that policy has been fairly effective in pulling in additional research for orphan diseases. Other alternative policies for implement so this has obviously been an important instrument in the context of COVID vaccines. It's also potentially useful in the context of antibiotics. And a third approach, this is not an exhaustive list, but a third important approach in terms of pushing innovation in pharmaceuticals would be research funding by governments. So research funding, of course, requires governments to have the resources to do it. That's why most of that occurs in richer countries rather than poorer countries. But I think it is important to recognize, particularly in some of these emerging markets, that additional policies that complement, that sit alongside patent protection, can also play an important role in the direction and level of innovation in pharma. With these, all of these policy tools, patents, market exclusivity terms, prizes, public funding of research, an important challenge to bear in mind here is that because medical innovation is a global public good, we do need coordination between countries because a lack of such coordination can lead to insufficient government support. And I think that is important in understanding some of the negotiations behind the TRIPS agreement. It's an example of this kind of coordination with patent protection in the absence of international coordination. Of course, it is privately in the interest of a country like India or China to say, we'll let advanced countries create the environments to pull in R&D investment to generate pharmaceutical innovation and other kinds of health innovations. And of course, if you are China or India or any other emerging market, any other developing country, it's then very tempting to say, we'll just take that, right? The innovation exists, particularly with pharmaceuticals, the imitation costs are relatively low. It's very tempting and privately in the interest, and at least in the short term, for countries to just essentially free ride on the innovation incentives created in richer countries. But if everybody plays this game, we have insufficient investment overall. So TRIPS at least established this minimum level of protection to reduce some of this global free riding. I think in the context of research funding, I have other work showing that also seems to play a role, and that the US is by far the largest funder of medical research, and other countries do seem to choose their own funding in response to some extent to what the US is doing. So that suggests an important role for international organizations like the WTO to address some of these concerns. Of course, it's not clear that the burden should be equally shared across all countries. That's why there's so much debate here. But just like dealing with climate change, I think we have to understand that this is a global public good, and if every country decides to play a short-run game of protecting only its own interests, then globally we'll see some issues, some problems. So let me stop there and let you move on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for that incredibly efficient use of your time. You've covered a lot of really valuable territory there, setting what you've described as the blunt instrument of the patent system in its broader context. Our next presentation is from Dr. Fellner, who's going to deal with the question of industry practices on IP sharing. So, Paul, over to you, please.
Thanks very much. And now, Professor Kyle, you got the first slot, but I'm going to build on something that you said, which is the intellectual property provisions are a risk mitigation mechanism for the industry, particularly in a field where the cost of initial entry is exceedingly high. The discovery process is complex, but the real difficult and expensive process is transforming discovery into an acceptable pharmaceutical product that can be approved by health authorities to be effective and safe for patients to use. Once that's happened, it's easy to come in, to follow, to draft behind that innovation, to free ride. And if without any kind of mechanisms of protection of the market, the expected reasonable market exclusivity, the prior investment simply won't occur under the current regime. And we'll get to the point about investment and where it comes from and the money flows as I go on. But right now, the reality is that if the private sector isn't confident about its investment, it won't make it. There are other avenues of investment that are a surer bet, and if it's easy to knock off pharmaceutical innovation. So you need to have these mechanisms in place. And yes, in a way, a patent is a blunt instrument, though I would take issue with that. Every patent is examined individually. Every patent has its own bases for patentability, and every patent is individually subject to attack by once granted, those who believe it was granted improvidently or that they don't infringe it. It's actually a uniquely attuned mechanism for, well, to hark back to another era and a less uncertain time, individual combat on the facts and of the individual patent. Blunt instrument is no patents at all, because then you have no evaluation or consideration of the individual technology, whether it's new and whether it's valuable. So if you want the discoveries of the basic molecules, but also the improvements, and this is, by the way, 3D, it's a dangling bait in front of me. I can't help but take it. If the innovation is of no value, then why the need to copy it? Why worry about the patent? And if the innovation isn't actually new or unobvious, the patent you won't be granted, or it should be subject to attack. So 3D, all it does is knock out meritorious inventions that improve the patient experience, that stabilize a product for transportation around the world. There are important formulation patents that either change bioavailability or stability in, say, warm weather environments. These are not trivial inventions, they're important. But if they were trivial, why the need to copy? But there's another aspect of the intellectual property protection that's important, and I've worked with clients who are interested in this, and that is to assure quality. If everybody can come into a market, regardless of quality, and it's sometimes in unregulated situations that's true, there are ethical innovators, particularly in rare disease space, who actually want to be sure that if there's technology in the market, it is of sufficient quality that patients can rely on it. Patents are actually a mechanism to ensure that. I went to the economic risk issue. Strong IP protections in the industry now are regarded as an essential component for investment in a market. A company will build up an infrastructure of a local organization if there's a solid legal basis, and patents and intellectual property rights generally are a part of that. So we go back to the issue of necessary, but not in them of themselves sufficient. However, TRIPS compliance indicates an overall respect for law and predictability in law that helps de-risk the investment in a market. Now, when a company invests in a market, it starts to build up local knowledge. It hires people locally to learn the technology, to learn about the products that they're selling, why they're useful, to learn about that interface between development and getting products into use in hospitals or by doctors and available in pharmacies. These things don't happen on their own. There's a substantial amount of learning that has to occur. And that investment in learning will happen if there's some reliability in that market for the investment to occur. Once that begins to happen, now there's the potential for innovation in a market. Individuals who've learned at the knee of the multinational pharmaceutical company can actually go start their own businesses. There's that knowledge base has been built up. Now, of course, this does require that there is a fair balance here, and I'm not an absolutist in protection, particularly in onerous non-compete agreements and other restrictions on the ability to use general learning. But I think that that's an important component of a legal regime that's fair and balanced and predictable, and one that adopts the TRIPS policies. The contrary, the regression to the mean or tragedy of the commons, is a short-term economic boost, but not sustained. There's always another country that will pirate more effectively, more efficiently. As a market starts to build up and become valuable, somebody else will see the opportunity to step in. So that's not going to be sustainable if it's built on taking innovation, not creating innovation. Also, the developed markets will find ways to block those countries off. And you could see it in the pattern of generic drug distribution, for example, in opportunistic markets. For example, I was given the anecdote of Malta for a while, which had free trade with Europe, but nobody bothered filing patents in Malta. Well, that ended pretty quickly, and Malta had a short-term run as a distribution center for generic drugs, but it's not one now. So that's not a very sustainable model. Then the next point is coming back to the financial condition. If these rights are a necessary condition for investment, then that's the question, why? Why is the investor so interested in it? Well, if your investment is primarily profit-driven, then you're going to want to maximize the return of the individual target of your investment. The company you've put money into, you want them to outcompete the market. But when we're talking about healthcare, there are two issues that I think aren't considered well enough. The first is that ultimately the public is paying. Even in the United States of America, the alleged shrine of Adam Smith, there's a very visible hand that's preventing free market negotiation on pricing. Our biggest drug buyer, which happens to be Medicare and Medicaid, isn't actually allowed to negotiate drug prices. This isn't free market. This is crony capitalism. But the investors need to have in mind an outcome, or the buyers, ultimate buyers, an outcome that they want. And they need to be willing to spend money on alternatives, to invest in those alternatives. You could, in my view, argue till you're blue in the face about how bad intellectual property is. And my response is constantly, then invest in an alternative. Invest in a company that it promises fair pricing and access as their primary drivers, that isn't solely interested in increasing quarterly profits. But this means that the investors can't be interested in increasing quarterly profits. If the investors change their tune, then we can look for different outcomes. This is an issue in COVID-19 that's flabbergasted me. The big investments coming from the government organizations and from philanthropies are still tied to this old model of the individual company benefiting. If it were up to me, I would put the money into the companies the way the United States did. I think that was appropriate and brilliant response to the pandemic. But I would condition it on everything you do must be transparent. Because at the end of the day, I don't care if you, Pfizer, you, Moderna, you, AstraZeneca, you, whomever, produces a vaccine. I care that a vaccine is produced. And if you're making the information you're developing public, help somebody else get there faster, my end game, faster vaccination of the population, is achieved. And I don't care whether it's achieved by you or somebody else. If I'm a private investor, if I'm investing my retirement income in Pfizer, yeah, I want them to keep it secret. I want them to have the only vaccine, and I want them to make umpty $1 billion on that vaccine, because then my investment goes up. But that shouldn't be the driver for philanthropies. It shouldn't be the driver for government. And once you move that investment to a more competitive space, others are going to follow. Why? Because there's underlying intellectual property rights driving this. There's still control. It's just that the part of the cost of participating isn't a cash return. It's an innovation and knowledge return. This, the software industry has discovered and exploited with great effect, and it's a significant foundation to the commercial success of that industry. But all of it relies on the existence of robust intellectual property rights that can back up the contractual relationships and obligations that the financiers need to impose if we want to have that kind of change. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paul. And you've touched on indeed one of the really very topical questions that I think policymakers are wrestling with in the COVID response. Exactly that, where there is not only public investment but exceptional public investment in medical research, how to get the health benefits and not merely commercial benefits. So that's something that I think several questions have touched on. So you've helped prepare the way for that. Another very topical question, one that's attracting a lot of attention in the Geneva policy community right now, dealing with COVID, is exactly what Professor Abbott is about to touch on. As the slides tell you, localization of pharmaceutical production and the dissemination of health technologies. So Fred, with thanks again, over to you.
All right. I think I have my mic live. So thank you very much, Tony, and thanks to all of the other commentators. As Tony just mentioned, I'm going to be discussing localization of pharmaceutical production and the dissemination of health technologies. And what I'm going to talk to you about relies in part on work that I've previously done, most recently sponsored by the Open Society Foundation, looking at the role of financing in improving the local production context in Africa. I previously, for the World Health Organization, financed by the European Union, studies of China's policies with respect to promoting its domestic local production infrastructure and India's local production infrastructure. So to begin at the beginning, why local production? Well, World Health Organization has been involved in this for quite a while and promotes local production for a number of reasons. There are more than this, but improving security of supply, building your health technology infrastructure, which includes promoting science and technology, enhancing your regulatory capacity, disincentivizing substandard drugs by giving the domestic producers an incentive to police the market, better tailoring individual drugs to local needs, significantly reducing balance of payment outflows by relying on domestic inputs. And I think that, well, we're going to talk about this a bit later. COVID-19 has illustrated the risks of dependence on imports of pharmaceutical products. This is obviously a quite complex subject matter, but localization of production is increasingly perceived as a matter, I'll refer to it as public health security. When we look at local production, there's a tremendous amount of factors that need to be considered. There's a large array of evolving technologies in the area of production. Most recently, we see attention to new mRNA technologies, for example, in the area of vaccines, but even in the small molecule chemical production, as well as biologics generally, things are always changing. The diagnostic, therapeutic, and vaccine production markets are rather distinct. Each is governed by different factors. The global pharmaceutical industry as a whole has been transitioning from small molecule chemical to biologic-based drugs, which involves entirely different types of production processes. We've looked at financing as a tremendously important element in this area. Of course, you have issues regarding property, machinery, and equipment, and Dr. Fellner was just mentioning software. If you go through a pharmaceutical production facility, you'll see that today a great part of it is controlled by sophisticated computer software. You have issues with basic infrastructure, transport, electricity supply. Where do you acquire your raw materials, intermediates, APIs, finishing components, where biologic starting materials? And an element of local production, of course, is that most of this is in the hands of the private sector. I'll add again, we talked about it in the first session, China. Again, China is nominally a private pharmaceutical industry country, but most of its large pharmaceutical producers are in fact owned substantially by the government. So you have a real mixed situation there. You have two very different types of markets for the producers. Again, I think most of you are familiar with this. You have a generic market, which is intensely price competitive. We talk about pennies or less than pennies per pill as being the factor that will move a factory from country A to country B. You have significant competitive advantages today held by government countries with substantial domestic markets and supportive government policies, including direct and indirect subsidies and well-developed internal infrastructures. So these are advantages that China and India both enjoy, which is one of the reasons I chose to study those two areas. Each of them has followed somewhat different paths in developing its pharmaceutical sector. Each have been quite successful. Both of them relied on the pre-TRIPS and early phase weak IP environments to facilitate their buildup. And I think it's just worth recalling that, but also that the real success monetarily for India's pharmaceutical industry came from its decision to upgrade its production facilities to stringent GMP so that it could export to high value, high income markets. The originator market is quite different. Their advantages are derived from R&D and legislated monopoly positions, whether it's patents or market exclusivity. Originators don't typically license out their patent protected distribution to independent third parties, but they do enter into joint ventures and manufacturing outsourcing agreements. Manufacturing costs are typically a comparatively minor part of originator pricing, and the recovery of R&D costs and capital for future expenditure, which may include acquisitions, is what is looked at. Our most recent study, I had 4 collaborators who have been heavily involved in the Africa region, including those involved in the science, both of pharmaceutical and vaccine production, were involved in creating the BioVac facility and so forth. But putting that aside, Africa is a diverse region with very different characteristics on a country basis, whether it's geographic, socioeconomic, the health burdens, the political systems, infrastructure, education system, language, cultural traditions, and so forth. So it's difficult to talk about kind of homogenized solutions, although we'll get back to that. But the local production solutions need to account for this complexity. What we found is that the real problem with African pharmaceutical production at the moment is a market problem. That is that you don't have a sufficient demand in most countries to really make a sound business model sustainable. Quite a number of the markets are insufficient to support robust manufacturing. Another big issue, which many of you are familiar with, is that international procurement, like the Global Fund and PEPFAR, limit purchases to stringent GMP compliant products, and very few of those are produced in Africa. Government procurement policies are very typically aligned with procuring the lowest cost product, which is typically not, well, very typically a Chinese or Indian produced product, which makes it very difficult for the local manufacturers to compete. You have internal barriers. Maybe the most serious is the non-integrated regulatory approval processes. Now, the problem isn't that there isn't enough capital in global markets to finance local production in Africa. I would characterize the current global financial situation as awash with capital seeking returns. The problem is that investors, even ESG investors and social impact investors, still want to obtain a return on their investment. So you have to figure out a way of putting together a market situation that works for investors. We're going to talk about the pandemic, but I would just note that the market for pandemic vaccines, I'll call it episodic. It's difficult for private investors because of the on-again, off-again characteristics of the market and the changing demands. So you almost certainly need advanced purchase commitments, subsidies, and so forth. Well, what are some of the things that we looked at and have talked about as solutions to this? And bear in mind, we've had pretty extensive discussions with the African Development Bank and others, the World Bank, IMF, involved in this area. Well, a key possibility is to rely on regional production hubs. You could have, for example, 4 regional production hubs in Africa. You could improve regional procurement mechanisms to create an integrated demand structure. You can work on integrating the regulatory approval processes. An important component is removing trade barriers. So here you have the implementation of the African Free Trade Agreement. And this might really help create larger scale markets for the African producers. You need to bolster financial support, development bank backstops, credit guarantees, sovereign wealth funds, World Bank lending, IMF liquidity assistance to central banks, considering local production as social impact investing and trying to attract some of the major investors into the area. and improving the transparency through foundations. You have very important need for focus on government policy instruments, including infrastructure, and this requires prioritizing local production to consider it comparable to defense, energy, and agriculture. You need subsidies, tax incentives, procurement preferences, tariffs, particularly to offset foreign government intervention as forms of infant industry support. And bear in mind that the high income countries employ these tools routinely. The US gives $30 billion a year annually in R&D subsidies through the NIH and has massively subsidized the pandemic response. You have examples in Europe and China with its domestic incentives, all used to bolster these growing industries. You can also look at flexibilities provided by WTO rules applicable to regional agreements. I would note that I don't think localization of production in Africa, for example, should be an easy mechanism to lower pharmaceutical prices, at least in the near to medium term. I think the costs of ramping up these production capacities are going to impose costs in the short term. How that will play out in the long term is very difficult to predict, but I would look at it as more as a continental security matter than simply a cost reduction matter. And I think I'm wrapping up here. So when we look at technology transfer, we have to look at joint venture arrangements. We have to look at the formation of technical training institutes, the WHO, Martin Fried and so forth, working on WHO technology hubs. You have non-voluntary licensing as an option in reserve to press for the grant of licensing. It's very important that we work on, or Africa, for example, works on upgrading GMP so that it can gauge international procurement and expand its export opportunities. Inherent in enhancing local production is expanding your regional R&D. I think these things go hand in hand. And finally, I would just note there was a recent trend in plurilateral and bilateral trade agreements to prohibit conditioning direct investment on technology transfer. And so I just raised the question whether that is really an appropriate policy for developing economies and whether you might want to pay some close attention to agreeing to these provisions which may preclude you from conditioning FDI on tech transfer as a means of progressing your technology infrastructure. So I realize that was quite quick. There's a lot to discuss, and thank you very much.
No, Fred, that's fantastic. You've got through a lot of really solid material there, very clearly and succinctly, and these are very much very current issues today, and I think you've helped really illuminate the toolkit open to countries to deal with this question of further disseminating, distributing production capacity. We have a few minutes now for specific questions before we move to a sort of closing resumption session. And Paul, and to some extent, Fred have opened up the link to the specific challenges of COVID. But for the moment, we have a number of more general questions. One concerns whether the nature of the right balance. We often hear about this in IP policy debates generally, but it often comes across as quite an abstract idea. What's it mean in practice, striking the balance, and in particular, how might this vary according to different members? Is the same set of balancing mechanisms at the same level of balance for individual countries? How does that vary? And to what extent does this also relate to the effectiveness of disclosure of inventions through the patent system. That's of course part of the deal with the patent. It's a kind of a contract with the public that exclusivity is traded for disclosure. To what extent is that important? So that's one question that's come from Sarah Lucia from Colombia. Could we take the question, Margaret, Paul, and then Fred?
Sure. So I think clearly the trade-off varies by country. In practice with TRIPS, there were different groups of countries classed together by income level, and the requirements of TRIPS, and particularly the timing of TRIPS implementation, was allowed to vary by these country groups. But even within each group, of course, if you don't have much domestic manufacturing capacity versus India, the trade-off will not be exactly the same. And with a massive multilateral trade agreement such as TRIPS, it's very difficult to allow for those country-specific differences to guide, or it's difficult to address all of those country-specific differences in a large multilateral agreement. Bilateral agreements obviously would allow for a somewhat more scope there. On the disclosure, I mean, frankly, if a patent is filed somewhere and in the world with the information disclosed, the information is out there. It's not like the information doesn't cross borders when there's not a patent filed in a specific country. So for me, that doesn't seem first order, given that you have a patent application filed somewhere. But perhaps my colleagues feel differently.
No, I completely agree. I mean, the fundamental impetus of patents is disclosure of the information. If there weren't patents, there would be no incentive. You'd want to hide that information as long as possible to maintain the competitive advantage against other competitors in the same market. Yeah, it's really important to note that the information is available everywhere, even though the ability to enforce the patent right is only available in those countries where the right is sought and obtained. And even then, it's a risk that you will not succeed in the civil litigation to enforce your patent. So there's actually a lot of uncertainty. Patent is not a behemoth. It's not a indefensible weapon. It's actually quite defensible because it's geographically limited and because it's vulnerable to attack by a motivated competitor. And really, the cost to attack a patent is relatively low compared to the cost to innovate around the patent or to do something different. So I think in that respect, and people think, well, if we didn't have patents, that would be great. But if we didn't have patents, we would not have the same level of knowledge. There would not be the security in publishing that information, or it would be withheld for a much longer period of time. You would not get the details about a pharmaceutical product until it launched. And that's assuming that the regulator would make that dossier largely publicly available as they do now. So, and as it is, we learn about the patented technology years before the product comes to market. That's a really important component that's often overlooked. People emphasize the negative side, that dissemination of information, and it won't be published in the scientific paper either until the patent application is filed. Even universities observe that process.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Excuse me. Fred, did you want to touch on that as well?
Yeah, well, I'll just add a few points, and I would, reiterate what Professor Kyle mentioned, which is I think that the utility of the patent system will vary quite considerably depending on the country in which it's being implemented and what role it plays in terms of social and economic development. And in terms of disclosure specifically, it is, I think, relatively uncommon that simply looking at patent disclosures is really even close to allowing the production of a particular pharmaceutical product. Bearing in mind that patent applications are typically filed, the base patents fairly early on in the process, where still a lot of development work is being done. But second, there's a great deal of distance between taking the basic patent knowledge and translating that into a formulated chemical product and all of the intervening steps that go on in the translation from the basic knowledge into production. So if you, and I say this because I've had this experience, if you visit a developing country pharmaceutical manufacturer and say, here, through the auspices of the NIH, we're able to provide this patent information to you, the response may be, well, that's very interesting, but we don't have the money to take that patent information and turn it into a finished pharmaceutical product. You need to really come back to us with a technology package, which includes a great deal more. And if you look at the typical pharmaceutical technology license and see the components that go into the manufacturing process, ultimately, you'll see how much work needs to be done in that area. So I agree with Dr. Fellner that without the patent system, you would have less of a public commons of knowledge that people can look at. And I think it's very important to have that. But I also would be careful not to conflate disclosure of patent information and beginning to produce pharmaceutical products, because there's a pretty big distance between A and B, and that may very much depend on what country you're in. Thanks.
Thank you.
Can I just add on that, on that particular point? So I certainly agree that the disclosure in a patent application is generally not sufficient to allow even one skilled in the art to immediately ramp up production. And that's one of the big concerns that many have raised about the proposed patent waiver for COVID vaccines and treatments, is that just waiving the patent doesn't mean that it's going to be instantaneous production in many of these low resource environments.
Thank you very much.
Quickly add, I feel like
go ahead.
Several people brought up in the Q&A the difference between biologic products and the small molecules. And much of this debate around patent policy entertains the fiction that it's kind of, one molecule with one patent on it, and let's think through the costs and benefits thereof. When we think about, modern biologic drugs, and, COVID vaccines are a great example. There's typically a large bundle of intellectual property. Some of it is patents, right? Some of it is held as trade secret, proprietary materials and data. Thinking about the ability to transfer that kind of, Professor Abbott talked about the full package, right? I think is becoming more and more expensive and more difficult. And we need to, therefore, I think, pay attention to, what types of resources and investment are available at the receiving end of such technology transfer. If we rely on the ability to diffuse technology that way.
Thank you, Ian. And just picking up a couple of the other questions that relate to this question of balance. I mean, these are issues that have threaded through the whole history of the patent system, but still very, very current. One question concerns the non-voluntary licensing. Fred mentioned this in his presentation. Non-voluntary or compulsory licensing. To what extent is there empirical evidence about the effect of that balancing measure? And then a broader question, not unrelated. Many developing countries are introducing competition policy frameworks, and this is something that certainly we've tracked here in the WTO. An area that was once concentrated in mainly in developed countries. The majority of developing countries now have competition laws, authorities of some character. To what extent is that one of the balancing factors in this context? So again, would the three current panelists like to comment on those balancing issues? Margaret?
So I guess I would see health policies related to price controls or or some sort of price cap used in practice is more important than using competition policy in the short run. I think where abuses are really flagrant, sometimes competition policy can play an important role. It does depend, some countries allow for competition authorities to go after excessive pricing, including in Europe. But I think that competition policy often is sort of the instrument of last resort in terms of pushing back against some of the potential, a lack of balance, let's say, in the power of the patent holders versus consumers or patient populations.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I would like to particularly address competition law because although it often isn't this case in practice as a underlying thesis, both competition law and intellectual property law are pro-innovation and pro-competitive. And it is absolutely the case, and I should make it quite clear, it is possible to abuse patent rights in an anti-competitive way, and laws in place to prevent that aggregation of power and suppression of innovation in an unfair way are an important component. Just as I mentioned earlier, having laws that protect the right to work are important, where you can enforce restrictive covenants in employment that prevent people from benefiting from the general knowledge that they gain. It's critical to have these systems in some kind of balance, which then goes to an issue. Well, what does balance mean? It does not mean the same ratio of goods or offsets everywhere in every place at the same time. It's a messy system. There's always going to be players pushing the envelope in one direction or another. This is, in fact, a fundamental component of innovation, which applies in all aspects of life, not just technology. Innovative commercial models, innovative social regimes, innovative government models. So we have to tolerate within certain reasonable parameters. And this is where I think TRIPS is an important component. It sets a baseline that I think is quite reasonable and at the end of the day, pro-competitive. And not in isolation, it's part of an overall system. And I'd say that the more legal certainty that's available in a market, including through TRIPS and intellectual property rights, the better the chance that people will take the risk of innovation, because there's only so many risks that an individual, an entity, a company, an institution can take. And so some of those risks have to be managed. Competition law is a risk management tool, just like intellectual property law is, and applied appropriately, it's an effective tool. Applied as an excuse to appropriate technology, I don't think that it's any better tool than patents applied to restrict competition and in an unfair way.
Thank you, Paul. Fred, would you like to comment also? There's the two aspects, the non-voluntary licensing. Do we have empirical data about the impact of that tool? And the broader question of competition policy as a balancing factor.
All right. Well, I want to start by noting that one of the things that a great deal of time spent reinforcing the fact in the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement and Public Health that every WTO member has the right to issue compulsory licenses, including government use licenses, on the ground of their own choosing. That situation certainly applies now. And in addition, if a government in an exigent situation considers that the specific terms of the TRIPS agreement are too onerous, they can rely on Article 73 of the TRIPS agreement for the national security exemptions. And my own personal view is that governments have a tremendous amount of inherent authority to override intellectual property if they believe it's necessary to address critical public health needs. One of the major advantages, I think, of using a compulsory licensing system is it provides a basis for remuneration. Remuneration may be debated, but under the compulsory licensing system, other than sometimes in the competition law element or use, you typically have an objective evaluation of the value of the underlying technology, which is returned to the patent owner. As terms of its utility, as Professor Reichman and I have explained on a number of occasions, one of the primary functions of the compulsory licensing regime is a background for intellectual property related negotiations. We've seen this happen many times from a historical standpoint, which is that the overhang of a threat of a compulsory license is sufficient to induce accommodations between the industry and the public health system. And I would note that at the very beginning of the pandemic, Professor Reichman and I authored an article in the Journal of International Economic Law, which proposed the creation of a technology pool for COVID-19 technologies, which would have a compulsory character, but would also involve remuneration to the technology developers. It does not involve overriding patents. It involves using the patents for public development, and we envisaged very substantial compensation potentially going to the technology developers. We're not at all opposed to paying companies what their the value of their innovation, but we think that that would have made a mechanism for sharing the technology more widely. Of course, we were dealing with a very fractious international environment and hard to get countries to agree on pretty much anything. In terms of competition law, Tony, as you may be aware, for the United Nations Development Program, I authored and edited the guidebook on using competition law to promote access to health technologies. We have our supplement on using competition law to promote access coming out shortly. I've done a good deal of work on excessive pricing in the era of pharmaceuticals. Again, because of the complexity of implementing and enforcing competition law, as Professor Kyle noted, it may not be the first best resort depending on the situation, but it plays an exceedingly important role in keeping enterprises honest and protecting the interests of consumers. It is in and of itself a subject matter for a whole day webinar like this, so I'm not going to try to go into the details of all that right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Fred. And it was kind of unfair posing that question to you, because indeed you've published very widely on both of those issues raised. And that brings to mind, we are going to post links to the panelists' relevant literature that has been referred to throughout the webinar. And in a spirit of self-promotion, I would mention we had a separate webinar on IP and competition a couple of weeks ago, and those not looking at public health in particular, but more broadly. And so that's another resource we can link to.
If I could intervene briefly on the issue that Dr. Abbott raised in his article on creating a technology access pool. There has been one created, the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, or CTAP, under the auspices of the World Health Organization and at the prompting of the country Costa Rica early in the progress. I don't know for sure whether there was reliance on your paper, but it's clearly the same idea, absent the compulsory license piece. And I will say the words compulsory license raise hackles in the biopharmaceutical industry. So if you want to have the biopharmaceutical industry stop listening to you and become polarized, talk about compulsory licensing. But if you talk about technology pools, this is actually something a lot of companies already engage in at the discovery section. Some companies have engaged in clinical development. And the thing about a pool is everyone has the potential for benefit, not only because the pool will provide for appropriate remuneration for the donation of technology, but actually an effective pool requires the redonation of technology developed from the withdrawal from the pool. This is why the Linux system developed that platform so rapidly. It required the return of technological advancement. This happens all the time. Many times generic manufacturers have more effective synthetic processes for innovative medicines than the innovator, because they've had time to develop that. In the context of COVID-19, if every improvement was returned to the pool, everyone would have the potential to benefit from that additional technical information, all of which could accelerate solutions. So I do completely agree that the technology access pool idea is an important component of a robust international response. It probably won't impact COVID-19 very much, but the exercise and perhaps setting it up will help ensure that the next pandemic, and I'm pretty confident there's going to be another one, having now seen 4 in just my lifetime, or 5 if you count swine flu in the 70s, not all of which materialized like COVID-19, but all of which had the potential to. We will need these kinds of accelerators of response in place to really reach the true potential of the knowledge available in the world. Thanks.
Tony, can I briefly reply to that?
Absolutely.
The point I would make in response is that we seem to be in agreement that the idea of having a pool is a valuable one, and we don't need to go into all the details about that right now. In our article, we surmise that there would be difficulty in securing voluntary contributions. And in fact, the experience of CTAP has been a virtual complete dearth of voluntary contributions from the industry into the WHO pool. So that's the reason we thought that you would probably need government pressure to create the impetus to move the technology into the pool. And we envisage the creation of an architecture in which this would work on a multilateral basis. Perhaps it will be part of the discussions of a pandemic treaty succeeding where we are now. But I simply want to reemphasize that Professor Reichman and I were not talking about taking anybody's patents. I am perfectly happy if a biopharmaceutical company makes a good amount of money, a strong return on investment for investing in technology. I have no problem with that. My concern is to get the technology shared, get production ramped up as many places as possible, and to address the public health needs. And I wish I thought that would work by relying on voluntary initiatives of the industry. If someone has a better solution, because currently, right now, we don't have voluntary contributions at any meaningful level. So I just wanted to emphasize that point.
This is a very important exchange because well, first of all, because you've answered one of the questions I was saving for the wrap-up session, but more importantly, the current debate, even today's webinar, is it's partly about thinking through what Paul has mentioned, that there will be global health crises in future. Nobody could possibly argue that the response this time around has been ideal, and so there's a strong appetite to at least learn the very hard lessons from this. But we'll turn to that in the closing session. There's just one very specific question, because we are looking at the question of local production, or at least the dispersion of production capacity, particularly in the developing world. And that's a very topical, very practical question right now. So there's several questions that are touching on that. So I'd like just to get the panelists' reflection on this. Firstly, the concern that import substitution, well, that's one way of describing, I suppose, local production initiatives. How do you prevent that from being, well, the question says very dramatically, accessible for corruption, rent seeking by local monopolists, and leaving local consumers paying high prices, which is one take on it, I suppose. But more broadly, the question about the issue whether this is not proceeding because of the lack of a holistic view of how to promote R&D and the scaling up of production capacity. And indeed, Fred, your presentation, you pointed to a whole range of factors that have bearing on this. But just because the local production issue is a very burning practical one right now, it'd be interesting to hear from our 3 panelists right now, just your quick reflections on that, noting that it has been covered to some extent already. So Margaret, would you like to head off?
Sure. I won't take too much time because I think there are others who are more experts on this specific issue. I would just note that there's a lot of local production in Europe that didn't really help the rollout of the vaccine in Europe. There's a lot of local production in India of the COVID vaccines. It hasn't had a huge impact on the current situation in India. So local production in and of itself isn't necessarily sufficient. I think it needs to be understood in the context of other trade barriers, other agreements in place, obviously. Clearly, it doesn't make sense for every country around the world to have its own domestic manufacturing of COVID vaccines or any other product. That's the point of trade. That's the big benefit of global trade, is to get us away from such a model. So, let's not lose sight of other policies and global cooperation.
Thank you very much. Paul, any quick remarks along those lines on that question?
Yeah, look, I think the potential for the cesspool exists, and in fact, intellectual property rights can help offset this by providing a counterweight to government corruption. And governments, seeing this, they're run by people, are as susceptible to corruption as the private sector is. But if a private interest is able to challenge a deal between a local manufacturer and the government that results in poor quality or high-priced local product, that is, I would suggest, beneficial in that particular market. And where intellectual property rights are not available, they're not adequately enforced, that balancing mechanism is no longer in place. And I know of markets where local generic manufacturers are able to charge substantially higher prices even than the generic version of the international model because of kind of sweetheart deals and local favoritism. This is a market with weak intellectual property protections, and therefore there's no offsetting mechanism. And many times we need to have these opportunities to challenge sweetheart deals and unfair competition in that respect as well.
Thank you, Paul. So Fred, over to you. Respecting that you've already actually covered this issue very, very handsomely, both in your presentation and in the papers referred to, but any reflections in response to those questions?
Well, I'm just curious as to where the cesspool of corruption is supposed to be. Is that one IMDb and the global financial capital markets? Is that in Europe with the recent scandals over non-existent bank balances and resulting in losses of multi-billions of dollars? I think if we're looking around for corruption in financial markets and governments, it's pretty hard to figure out exactly who the stone should be thrown at, number one. Number two, as an argument against Africa developing a dynamic pharmaceutical sector through the auspices of the African Union, the African Development Bank, and the local manufacturers, I'm going to give governments credit for being able to police their own activities and their own markets. And, almost all governments today are emphasizing the localization of production. That's the United States, that's the European Union, that's Australia, that's Singapore, that's China, that's India, that's Africa. Now you can ask yourself whether and how that should fit in with Adam Smith's comparative advantage thesis, and whether we should be emphasizing public health requirements in that way, and that's a very big question for debate. But I don't think the fact that you have import substitution going on is a reason not to develop a localized pharmaceutical industry.
Right. Well, thank you very much, and thanks to all panelists for engaging with these questions. I mean, these are tough issues, but I think the spectrum of views and the experience brought to bear has been incredibly illuminating, and it's also meant that the time I've got set aside for my summing up has extinguished, which I'm very happy to announce, because in the closing session, we'd like to hear from each of the panelists some concluding thoughts. I will say, in lieu of my summary, not only to the participants in our capacity building course, but more generally the public, this work that we put together with it won't come up in the system, will it? This work that we put together with the World Health Organization and the World Intellectual Property Organization, a volume called Promoting Access to Medical Technologies and Innovation. We'll provide a link. This is exactly developed to set out that holistic approach that has been discussed in the questions, and indeed refers to all of these initiatives, programs, balancing factors, ways of fine-tuning the patent system, all of these issues that have been discussed this afternoon. So we hope that provides a framework, and indeed we do have we do have in that volume a way of mapping the central focus of access and innovation as the primary objective. None of the tools we've been talking about this afternoon are justified in themselves. In the public health area, we want to see innovation. We see this acutely in the response to the COVID pandemic, and we want to see obviously access to that innovation. And the current very vital urgent debate about vaccine equity at the moment is at the most acute form of that concern. And then you can map out from that the different drivers, the different forms of leverage, the different forms of intervention, the different economic commercial structures that lead in or feed into those outcomes. So I would, for those following this course and more generally, I would certainly encourage people to look at that framework. But let's turn then to the closing session and to ask our brilliant panelists to offer some concluding comments. It's open to you, colleagues. You're very independently minded. I'm not going to try and direct you too much, but I would pose this broad question. Today's webinar initially opened up with a reflection on 25 years of the impact of implementation of the IP system, at least as framed by the TRIPS agreement, and the discussions even went back 10 or more years prior to that, the emergence of the negotiations that even gave us the TRIPS agreement. That's contrasted with the very urgent and, as some have said, very particular question of responding to the pandemic, and even more particularly the question of vaccines, because the whole research and development ecosystem and even the economics of vaccines is distinct compared to other medical technologies. So the question is, how can we bridge between these two broad perspectives? The overall lessons from the last 25 years or so, roundabout, in dealing with intellectual property and its impact on innovation and diffusion of health technologies. Then on the other hand, okay, this is an exceptional time. What have we learned from this dreadful experience over the last year or so? And then bring the two ideas together. If we do hope with a new dawn to be building back better, as many have proclaimed, what does that mean in terms of a resilient and inclusive and equitable health, innovation and access system? So that's at least something to prompt your concluding comments. Ian, Professor Cochrane, can I turn to you first?
Thank you. Yeah, I'd say, well, let us go back to the 70s and 80s. I think, and reflect upon what the World Life Sciences Enterprise looked like then and what it looks like now. I think there's a couple of kind of glaring failures of the international regime around intellectual property rights and patents. One is the problem of, it's very visible in the work that I have done, or Professor Kyle and others have done. Back in the pre-TRIPS era, and in the countries which took a long time to get to TRIPS compliance, one of the big failures was there was lots of innovation in medical science and in pharmaceuticals in particular. Much of that never reached many people in the world. And I and others have argued that one of the benefits of extending patent rights has been to address that kind of problem. Historically, countries with weak or absent intellectual property rights only saw an incomplete set of new drugs, and often with a very long delay. Now, I think the TRIPS agreement, as it's unfolded, my sense is has gone some way to addressing that problem. I think a second big failure, which relates to the topic of my opening presentation, is the inability of the global life sciences innovation system to tap into and harness the intellectual capital and creativity and energy of people in many parts of the world. Right? You can't really effectively participate in the life sciences research enterprise. I think without having the ability to sustain that engagement, of which intellectual property rights are a critical sort of piece of legal and regulatory infrastructure. I think that our study points to growing ability of countries whose populations have been previously excluded from participating in that through domestic pharmaceutical life sciences research activity. I expect that will continue to grow in the future. Now, I don't think everything is rainbows and unicorns. My fellow participants in this seminar pointed to some of the dilemmas and difficulties posed by the blunt instrument of patent rights. One of the things I think we need to reflect upon and recognize is that globalization of research and production in life sciences has a strong countervailing force, which is agglomeration and clustering. And so, every country in the world or every major city in the world have economic development people working hard to try to create a life sciences cluster in their city or their country. The forces of agglomeration and clustering, I think, work against that. So, it may be that notwithstanding the extension of IPRs, which support a research enterprise and participation in science, whether it be academic or commercial or clinical, that may not happen everywhere. And I do think there's a strong argument to think about the extent to which this can happen, and to recognize that there is a trade-off of costs and benefits. Professor Abbott talked about the flow of what he characterized as rent extraction through patents. There are opposite flows. Research funding, the whole mechanism behind the scenes of this globally disaggregated and diffused research enterprise. Whether or not in any particular country or any particular circumstance, those come anywhere near to balancing out, I think is an open question. I'm not really sure what to think about the COVID situation. I will just close with the observation that the vaccines that we have in front of us, whether it be from BioNTech, like Moderna, Janssen, AstraZeneca, or elsewhere, I think remarkable ability of the global life sciences enterprise to get behind this and create these new vaccines and extraordinarily fast, reflects one of the great long-run benefits of supporting innovation in the way in which it's been supported historically in North America, Europe, and the OECD countries.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you again for the paper and the presentation presented earlier. Next, some concluding comments from Mr. Wilson. Tim, would you like to just add a couple of quick comments to conclude?
Yeah, I will be very brief. It's been a very interesting session, so thank you to all the other speakers. I suppose the thing I was struck by is it does take a long time for us to observe the impacts of changes in the incentive mechanism. So over 25 years, we were able to observe it. But that may seem very slow, but that's just how long it takes for some of these things to change and be observable. The flip side of that is we only see change that we have predictable incentives for. So I think we should be wary of the things we do in this pandemic for the expectations of the future. We always have that tension between the short term and the long term, and that is true in a pandemic because of the next pandemic as well. And then just one other point is that Margaret's presentation of the different incentives I think was great, but the point is these are tools we can use together. These aren't or, they can be and. We need to target them, but that doesn't mean we need to choose one over the other. But I will stop there.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much. Professor Abbott, Fred, would you like to offer some concluding comments?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. And I think I will primarily focus on the pandemic. And I'd start by noting that what we're dealing with is really a massive failure of global public policy, but it was a failure that preceded the pandemic, and a failure to attend to critical planning matters that really was held in abeyance for years. And we already had significant evidence of the problem back during the 2014-2015 Ebola crisis and the response at the WHO and so forth. We knew that the originator industry had largely exited from vaccine manufacturing because of the lack of adequate market incentives. So we knew that if a really large scale event occurred, that we weren't going to have the production capacity to address it. Part of this is just this isn't a critique of the patent system as such, because it does play some significant roles, but what the system that we have currently for developing and supplying pharmaceuticals is based on the aggregation of capital through the promise of patent returns, and then industries which require making a certain level of profitability to want to build and roll out particular vaccines, for example, as well as drugs. The vaccine market, and particularly a pandemic vaccine market, doesn't work with that type of arrangement. You really need government subsidization and government planning and government programs for the maintenance of vaccine production facilities with, take or pay agreements and so forth, without getting into all of the details. But we didn't have that in place. And the part of the response of the current situation is there's just no really easy way to fix that with immediacy. To build a vaccine manufacturing plant of the traditional type between the planning for the facility and ultimate certification is a period of a number of years. Even there's some theories about new mRNA facilities. Can they be built more quickly? Can they be certified more quickly? How fast can you ramp up? It depends on the technology. But the problem we're currently facing is largely a problem of a failure of planning for a low probability, high risk event. And we can only hope that governments will not forget about it a year after this pandemic fades, and that we're able to keep attention focused on the need for future planning. I am not echoing, I think, what Professor Coburn mentioned a bit. I think we were fortunate to have Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca able to move into a fairly rapid translation and production and begin large-scale supply of vaccines. And you know, whether they may or may not have licensed more technology more quickly and so forth is a good question, but I don't think that there was really a question of being able to suddenly and very vastly expand vaccine manufacturing production. It's something that takes time, and of course nobody's happy about that. Everyone wants to do something, but this is largely a product of a failure of advanced planning, which is the thing that needs to be remedied when we look into a pandemic treaty which succeeds this event. So that's going to require mechanisms for, you know, facilitating R&D, for translation of research into usable products, for planning and building out production facilities, critically maintaining those production facilities when there isn't an exigent situation existing, and so forth. And this is clearly a multi-billion-dollar effort which needs international support. I don't doubt that there are ways that we can facilitate the transfers of technology, and I'm hoping we'll engage in a global cooperative effort that's going to move very quickly to expand production as quickly as possible wherever it can be expanded. But we're simply facing constraints based on the reality of the existing manufacturing capacity situation, and whatever we can do to improve that, so be it. But this is the world we're dealing with right now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fred. Now we turn to Dr. Fellner. Paul, your concluding comments, please.
Yes, well, thank you again very much for including me. It's been really interesting, and I've learned a ton today. Let me start broad and just say that I believe that TRIPS reflects a commitment to transparency, to respect for rights, and for legal predictability that are, to my mind, fundamental for fairness and for living well, including where it's a helpful innovation. Intellectual property rights are one tool in this overall arsenal. And I think the key from my perspective is that these legal regimes and transparency provide checks and balances so that we can negotiate mutually beneficial outcomes in situations. Now, how does this apply to COVID-19? I firmly believe that the TRIPS waivers will be counterproductive because the companies affected will resist, they will litigate, they will seek the support of their home governments. Efforts to disgorge the trade secret information are going to be resisted. And the level of cooperation that we've seen, which, while not what it could have been, has resulted in vaccines, of effective vaccines in less than a year, and in many positive aspects, will freeze because resources will be devoted to the resistance of compelled activities. The opportunity, in my view, is on the money side, the investment side. And I think if the governments of the world had added that component of not only putting money into solutions, vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, all of which was super appropriate, if they had said a condition for this is you participate in a cooperative process, you participate in a sharing pool, you collaborate with your erstwhile competitors because we're in a public health emergency and we're going to change the rules on a temporary basis, but we're going to pay for that. That investment, those billions of dollars in development costs, those billions of dollars in manufacturing enablement, those billions of dollars in assured market should have come with more benefit for society than they did. The same for the philanthropic investors. The goal should have been a solution to the problem, not the enrichment of an individual company, but the investments were made more on that latter basis. But I do also believe underlying all of this is the availability of intellectual property rights. The negotiated outcomes, which I think are going to be faster, and a voluntary pooling will still be faster than the resistance and litigation that compelled pooling would result in. Requires that checks and balances, requires the predictability, the trust in the system, which comes from predictable laws, which comes from respect for rights, which comes from transparency, which in my view, TRIPS reflects, the World Trade Organization reflects. These are all, in my view, net benefits. Yes, it's messy. It's just a lot less messy than the alternatives that exist as far as I can see. But I totally agree. The incentives have to be there on the payer side, both in the initial investment and then on the buying of products to help ensure that the incentives match and that the incentives for collaboration are there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope if the WTO is a bit messy, I hope it's at least not a cesspool, but that's for others to judge. The final concluding remarks from Professor Margaret Kyle. Margaret, over to you, please.
Well, thank you. And of course, in general, it's nice to have the last word, except that, again, I'm stuck with the challenge of finding something insightful to add after all of my colleagues have spoken. In addition, I think we're already over time, so I'll be extremely brief. What have we learned? I think overall, intellectual property rights can be a force for good in terms of incentives for innovation as well as access. I think the evidence, the empirical evidence that we have suggests that on average, they have been such a force for good, both in terms of innovation incentives as well as access. But we shouldn't forget that they interact critically with many other policies. So those can be health policies, those can be competition policies, those can be other innovation policies. IP is not sufficient by itself. Conversely, removal of IP will not by itself solve all kinds of access issues. But maybe one, to leave us on a more optimistic note, at least what we saw with TRIPS 25 years ago was an effort of the global community to come together and address this issue of a global public good. And it took a long time to negotiate, but at least we got there. And I hope that we'll see something similar with efforts post-COVID to do something similar with future pandemics. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we knew we had excellent panelists. We were very fortunate that they're also very efficient panelists, and we're just concluding a fraction over time. I won't extend that further, but rather to say, alongside the extra panelists, we see we have really excellent participants in the audience, and the questions have been very thoughtful, probing, informed, and getting to the nub of the issues. And I think within the limited framework of this kind of conversation remotely over silicon and LCDs, it's been very stimulating. I've certainly been on the edge of my chair, and deeply grateful to our panelists, deeply grateful to the participants in the capacity building course, and to the wider audience, and the respect and thoughtful character of all interventions, I think has been very encouraging, that we can work through these undoubtedly difficult and indeed controversial issues in a positive, forward-looking way. Certainly, that's something that we hope that will come from not only this webinar, but the whole range of outreach work and capacity building work that we are working on. And so we urge all those taking part and showing interest to keep in touch with us, to follow up the materials that we will be posting on the website for this webinar and more broadly. and reaching to those participants who are indeed working in incredibly challenging situations in their government systems, back in capital. We're very much with you. We know that this is a time of immense pressure and difficulty for governments across the globe, wrestling with exactly these complex issues. And you have our deepest respect and solidarity. So I'd like to conclude by thanking again this wonderful panel of experts. Very fortunate to have you, and you've really helped us prise open these issues in a very thoughtful, engaged, dynamic way. I'd like to thank the remarkable team here in this building that has made this work, that's made the connections fit together and made this kind of global conversation a reality. And finally, I'd like to thank you, the participants, the audience, for your engagement. It's an optimistic sign that you would like to engage with us and work with us, and we are certainly there with you virtually for the time being. And I hope actually when this health crisis finally spares us. So thank you very much to all, and please do keep in touch. So I wish you a very good morning, evening, or night, depending on where you are across the globe. Thanks also to people who've really joined us from challenging time zones. It's really appreciated. So thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Tony, for the invitation. It was great to participate in this event with my co-panelists and you and all of the participants worldwide. So thanks very much.
Yeah, I second that. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.